Before we begin, if you enjoy tales that peel back the gilded veneer of history to reveal the absurd and often grim realities beneath, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions. Here, we specialize in boring bedtime stories, narratives that are anything but boring, designed to lull you into a state of amused contemplation rather than sheer exhaustion. Tonight, we delve into the first chapter of a story that might make you look at medieval knights and their steeds in a very different light. Chapter 1. The Glorified Plow Horse. The horse's name was Brutus, though no one ever called him that. To the knight he was simply the horse, or on particularly exhausting days, the damned beast. Brutus was a towering destrier, bred for war, with muscles that rippled beneath a coat that had once been glossy black, but was now dull with dust and dried sweat. His hooves were chipped from relentless travel, and his eyes held the weary resignation of a creature that had long since accepted its lot in life. The irony of Brutus' existence was that he was, in theory, a celebrated figure. Songs were sung about knights and their loyal steeds, charging into battle with flags fluttering and lances gleaming. Paintings immortalized these moments, capturing the horse as a noble extension of the knight's own valor. But the reality was far less poetic. Brutus was not a partner in glory. He was a tool, no different from a sword or a shield, except that he required feeding and occasionally shat in inconvenient places. His days began before dawn, when the squire, a perpetually sullen boy named Edwin, would drag him from the stable, muttering about the injustice of his own existence. Brutus would stand, legs stiff from another night on hard-packed earth, as Edwin slapped a saddle onto his back with all the tenderness of a man wrestling a sack of turnips. The knight Sir Reginald of Hollowhill would then arrive, smelling of last night's wine and this morning's regret. He would mount Brutus with a grunt, dig his spurs into the horse's sides, and off they would go. Another day of pretending to be heroes. The problem with being a knight's horse was that no one cared about the horse. The knights got the glory, the peasants got the fear, and the horses got the blisters. Brutus had carried Sir Reginald through mud, rain, and the occasional poorly planned charge into a wall of pikemen. He had been praised when things went well and kicked when they didn't. Once, after a particularly disastrous jousting tournament, Sir Reginald had missed the opponent entirely and somehow managed to unhorse himself. Brutus had been blamed for lacking spirit. This was rich, considering the knight had spent the previous night drinking himself into a stupor, while Brutus stood tied to a post, swatting flies with his tail. The life of a warhorse was not one of adventure. It was one of monotony, punctuated by moments of terror. Between battles, Brutus was treated like a particularly expensive plow horse. He pulled carts when supplies needed moving, trudged in circles when the smith needed to fix his shoes, and stood for hours while Sir Reginald boasted to anyone who would listen about his exploits, most of which were exaggerated, and some of which had actually involved Brutus saving the knight's life, though you wouldn't hear that part in the retelling. The worst part, though, was the armor. Horses, in their infinite wisdom, had not evolved to wear 50 pounds of metal plating. The barding was hot, restrictive, and made it nearly impossible to scratch an itch. Flies would find their way beneath the straps, biting at Brutus' skin, until he twitched uncontrollably, which only earned him another kick from Sir Reginald for fidgeting. And if the armor wasn't bad enough, there was the crest, a ridiculous plume of dyed horsehair that fluttered from Brutus' headpiece, serving no purpose other than to make him look dashing. It was like wearing a hat made of someone else's tail, and it attracted every biting insect within a mile radius. But the true indignity came after the battles. Win or lose, Brutus was the one who had to carry Sir Reginald's weight, sometimes literally if the knight had been knocked unconscious, back to camp. There, while the knights drank and boasted, the horses were left to stand, still saddled, until someone remembered to water them. More than once, Brutus had gone an entire day without a drink, because Edwin had been too busy flirting with a kitchen maid to remember his duties. And so Brutus lived, day after day, a creature of immense strength and negligible value. He was a prop in Sir Reginald's story, a footnote in the grand tales of chivalry. No one sang songs about the horse that had carried a knight through a hailstorm of arrows. No one painted portraits of the steed that had shied away from a puddle because it was too tired to jump. Brutus was, in the end, just another glorified plow horse. Celebrated in theory, ignored in practice, and destined to die forgotten on some muddy field, far from the songs and the stories. The next time you hear a tale of a noble knight and his trusty steed, remember Brutus. Remember the flies, the blisters, the ungrateful knight, and the squire who couldn't be bothered. Remember that history is written by the riders, not the horses. And then perhaps be glad you weren't born a knight's horse. Chapter 2. Armor. Fashion over function. If there was one thing Brutus had learned in his years of service, it was that humans had a peculiar obsession with making things needlessly complicated. Take armor, for example. On the surface it seemed like a reasonable idea. Cover the horse in metal so it wouldn't get stabbed during battle. But as with most human inventions, the execution was less about practicality and more about looking impressive. The first time Brutus had been fitted for barding, he had assumed it would be like the light leather trappings some riders used, something to deflect an errant arrow or glancing blow. Instead, the smith had arrived with an assortment of clanging plates that looked like they had been pried off a particularly stubborn crab. There was a chanfron for his head, a crynet for his neck, a petrel for his chest, and flanchards for his sides. Each piece was engraved with Sir Reginald's crest, because apparently, if you were going to be miserable, you might as well be branded while you were at it. The weight was the first problem. A fully armored knight was already a burden, but now Brutus had to carry his own metal shell as well. It was like trotting around with a small cart strapped to his back. The armor didn't bend the way a horse did, so every stride was a negotiation between what his body wanted to do and what the rigid plates would allow. Turning quickly was out of the question. If a threat came from the side, Brutus had to either hope Sir Reginald noticed in time, or accept his fate as a very slow, very shiny target. Then there was the heat. Metal absorbed sunlight like a sponge, turning the armor into a portable oven by midday. On summer campaigns, Brutus could feel his own sweat pooling beneath the plates, turning his coat into a sticky mess. Flies, drawn to the damp, would crawl beneath the edges of the barding, nibbling at the places he couldn't reach to swat. The only relief came when it rained. Except then the armor would grow slick, making it even harder to keep his footing, and the inside would become a clammy, rust-scented sauna. But the real absurdity was how little the armor actually helped. The plates were designed to stop sword cuts and lance strikes, but they left gaps at the joints, convenient entry points for any weapon with a sharp point and a determined wielder. Once, during a skirmish, an enemy pikeman had thrust his weapon into the narrow space between Brutus' petrel and flanchard, missing his vitals by sheer luck. Sir Reginald had been furious, not because his horse had nearly been killed, but because the scratch had left a rust-prone groove in the otherwise pristine metal. The worst part, though, was the noise. Horses were creatures of quiet movement, attuned to the slightest sounds of danger. But encased in metal, every step Brutus took was a cacophony of clanks and rattles. It was impossible to hear anything over the din of his own armor, not the approach of enemies, not the shouted commands of allies, not even the ominous creak of a tree branch about to fall on him, which had happened once, though thankfully the armor had at least been useful for that. And yet, for all its flaws, the armor was non-negotiable. Sir Reginald insisted on it for every battle, tournament, and even the occasional parade. Because while it might not protect Brutus particularly well, it did make the knight look important. That was the true purpose of horse armor, not safety, but spectacle. A fully armored destrier was a walking status symbol, proof that its owner had enough wealth to waste on metal that could be better spent on, say, feeding the horse properly. So Brutus endured. He stood patiently as Edwin fumbled with straps, as Sir Reginald adjusted the fit for the 10th time, as the smith hammered out dents from the last battle. He plodded forward under the weight of it all, knowing that if he stumbled he would be blamed. If he balked, he would be whipped. And if he died, he would be replaced before the week was out. The next time you see a painting of a knight in gleaming armor atop his equally armored steed, remember the truth. Remember the heat, the noise, the chafing, and the sheer stupidity of it all. And then be grateful that no one has ever tried to make Cribbed wear a full suit of metal just to impress the neighbors. Chapter 3. The Jousting Trauma. If there was one thing worse than being a knight's horse in battle, it was being a knight's horse at a tournament. At least in war, a chaos had some semblance of purpose. Territory gained, enemies routed, lives tragically wasted in the name of some noble's ego. But jousting was pure distilled madness, a ritualized farce where men in metal suits paid good money to hurl themselves at each other while their horses suffered in confused terror. Brutus had been through enough jousts to know the routine by heart. It always began the same way. Sir Reginald, flush with ale and misplaced confidence, would announce his participation to anyone within earshot, usually while patting Brutus' neck as if the horse had volunteered for this nonsense. Edwin, the ever-enthusiastic squire, would then spend hours polishing armor, sharpening lances that were designed to splinter on impact, and, most bafflingly, braiding Brutus' tail, because nothing said I am a serious competitor like a horse with a fancy hairdo. The morning of the tournament was a special kind of hell. Brutus would be woken before dawn, fed just enough oats to keep him compliant, but not enough to give him energy, and then saddled with every piece of ceremonial barding Sir Reginald owned. The armor was even more impractical here than in battle, thicker, heavier, and adorned with enough ribbons and crests to outfit a parade float. The chanfron covering Brutus' face had eye holes just narrow enough to make peripheral vision impossible, ensuring that every joust would be as disorienting as possible. Then came the procession. The competing knights would ride their horses in slow circles before the crowd, basking in the applause while their steeds endured the deafening noise of trumpets, drums, and drunken spectators. Brutus had learned to tune it out, but the younger horses often panicked, bucking or rearing in terror, only to be yanked back under control by riders who seemed genuinely surprised that their animals didn't enjoy being surrounded by screaming humans. But the real horror began when the jousting itself started. Brutus knew the moment Sir Reginald lowered his visor and couched his lance that they were about to do something profoundly stupid. The rules of jousting were simple. 2 horses charged straight at each other, while their riders tried to smash wooden sticks into each other's torsos. The horses, of course, had no such objective. Their job was simply to run as fast as possible toward another 1,000-pound animal also running directly at them, an act that defied every instinct in their brains. The first time Brutus had been forced into a joust, he had balked. No sane creature willingly sprinted toward collision. But Sir Reginald had spurred him forward with a kick that left a bruise, and by the time Brutus realized what was happening, it was too late. The impact had been bone-rattling, the sound of splintering wood and clanging metal deafening, the shock of it reverberating through his entire body. And then, of course, Sir Reginald had been unhorsed anyway, because physics cared nothing for knightly pride. Over the years, Brutus had developed a theory. Jousting existed solely to humiliate horses. The lances might break, the knights might tumble into the dirt, but the horses, they were the ones who had to keep their footing, who had to endure the jarring stops, the sudden turns, the occasional stray splinter to the face. And if a horse dared to misstep, if it veered even slightly to avoid the impending crash, it was branded cowardly, unfit, destined for the glue pot. The worst part was the injuries. Knights wore layers of padding and armor to absorb the blows. But horses, they got bruises no one would ever see. Brutus' shoulders ached for days after every tournament. his legs stiff from the unnatural strain of accelerating and stopping on command. Once, after a particularly brutal pass, he had bitten his own tongue hard enough to taste blood for hours. Sir Reginald hadn't noticed. He'd been too busy complaining about the dent in his helmet. And then there were the accidents. The horse in the next stall over, a grey gelding named Argent, had gone blind in one eye after a splintered lance struck him mid-charge. Another, a spirited mare called Bella, had broken her leg during a poorly coordinated turn and been put down on the spot. The knights had toasted her memory with tankards of ale. Brutus had stood in his stall, listening to the muffled sobs of a stable boy who had actually cared about her. Tournaments always ended the same way, with Sir Reginald either bruised and sulking or, on rare, insufferable occasions, victorious. If he lost, Brutus would endure a silent, seething ride back to camp, the knight's grip on the reins too tight, his heels digging into Brutus' sides as if the horse were to blame. He won, there would be feasting, boasting, and inevitably more ale, which meant Brutus would be left tied outside some tavern, swatting flies until Sir Reginald stumbled out at dawn. The next time you watch a movie where knights joust in glorious slow motion, remember the truth. Remember the horses who had no choice, who ran headlong into violence because their riders demanded it. Remember the bruises, the broken bones, the blind eyes. And then ask yourself, if you were a horse, would you rather be a knight steed, or literally anything else? Chapter 4. Battles. Chaos Unbridled. Brutus had learned early that war was nothing like the songs. The minstrels spoke of glorious charges, of noble steeds thundering across the battlefield with their brave riders, of enemies scattering before their might. What they didn't sing about was the piss. It always started with the piss. The moment before battle, when the armored men around him would begin emptying their bladders in unison, a nervous chorus of splattering against leather boots and chainmail. Brutus had long suspected human bladders were directly connected to their fear glands, judging by how reliably this happened. Sir Reginald was no exception, though he'd claim it was just lightening the load for better mobility if anyone pointed out the dark stain spreading down his inner thigh. The rumpus would sound, a noise that still made Brutus's ears flatten against his skull, no matter how many battles he'd endured. And then came the shouting. Humans seemed incapable of waging war without an extraordinary amount of yelling. Commands, cries, prayers, last-minute confessions, and inevitably, someone screaming about their bowels. There was always one. Then, the charge. Brutus had once made the mistake of assuming the charge would be orderly, like the practice runs in the tournament fields. That illusion shattered the first time an arrow whizzed past his ear. Battle charges were chaos incarnate, a stumbling, jostling mess of heavily armored men and terrified horses all trying to move in the same direction while various sharp objects flew at them. The ground became treacherous with discarded weapons, bodies, some still moving, and the occasional surprised rabbit who'd chosen the worst possible day to forage. The noise was unbearable. Metal shrieking against metal, men screaming, horses screaming more sensibly, the wet thuds of impacts no one wanted to think about. Brutus quickly learned to differentiate the sounds. The hollow clang of a sword bouncing off armor, the meteor thunk of it finding flesh, the horrifying squelch of something sharp going into something soft. The worst was the sound of other horses going down, that terrible combination of crashing weight and panicked squeals that cut off too abruptly. And the smells. Blood, yes, but also the acrid stink of voided bowels, the metallic tang of sweat-soaked armor, the eye-watering reek of a blacksmith's too hasty work burning off lances. Brutus's nostrils would flare uncontrollably, trying to make sense of the olfactory assault, even as his body moved on pure instinct. The arrows were bad. The pikes were worse. Brutus had developed what he thought of as pike vision, the ability to spot those deadly sharpened poles jutting from enemy lines long before Sir Reginald did. The knight would be busy posturing, shouting challenges, or reciting some line from a poem he barely remembered, while Brutus's entire being focused on not impaling himself on the forest of death ahead. The few times he'd tried to veer away, Sir Reginald's spurs had reminded him sharply that horses didn't get opinions in battle. Then came the impact. No matter how many times Brutus experienced it, he'd never get used to the sensation of hitting a human body at full speed. There was a moment of resistance, sometimes soft, a poorly armored foot soldier, sometimes jarringly hard, another knight's armored mount, followed by the inevitable collapse. Bones broke under his weight, with sounds that haunted his dreams. Sometimes the fallen would grab at his legs as he passed, their dying reflexes seeking any purchase. Brutus had learned to kick out instinctively, a habit that earned Sir Reginald's praise for spirit, but left Brutus feeling hollow. The melee was its own special hell. Once the initial charge dissolved, the battle became a swirling nightmare of flashing steel and panicked movements. Brutus had to constantly adjust his footing on ground, growing slippery with blood and worse, all while avoiding the flailing weapons all around him. More than once he'd felt the searing pain of a blade sliding along his armored flank, leaving a trail of fire in its wake. Sir Reginald never noticed these wounds until after the battle, if at all. The worst were the fires. Seeger weapons, burning arrows, or just some fool knocking over a brazier, it didn't matter how they started. The moment smoke filled the air, Brutus's instinct screamed at him to flee, but the knight's reins and spurs kept him trapped in the nightmare. He'd seen horses, good, trained war horses, reduced to panicked, screaming wrecks when flames licked at their legs. The memory of a white mare named Snow running blindly through camp, her tail ablaze, still woke him some nights. When the battle finally ended, and they always did, though Brutus could never predict when, there was the aftermath. The slow picking through corpses, the cries of the wounded, the opportunistic looters already at work. Brutus would stand, trembling with exhaustion, as Sir Reginald either boasted of his exploits or nursed his wounds, depending on the day's outcome. No one checked the horses for injuries, unless they were limping badly. No one thanked them. No one remembered their names. The songs never mentioned how many horses died in battle. They didn't sing about the ones who broke legs in hidden holes, or took arrows to unprotected flanks, or simply dropped dead from exhaustion when the adrenaline faded. They certainly didn't mention the ones who had to be put down afterward, their injuries too severe but their deaths too slow. Brutus had seen it all, felt it all. And as he stood in the cooling dusk, the metallic scent of blood thick in his nostrils, he knew one truth with absolute certainty. Knights could keep their glory. All he wanted was a quiet field, no armor, and the distant memory of what it felt like to be just a horse. But tomorrow, if the trumpet sounded, he'd charge again. Because that's what war horses did. Until they couldn't. Chapter 5. The Knight's Ego, a Heavy Burden. Brutus had long suspected that if Sir Reginald's ego were physically weighed, it would require its own team of oxen to transport. The knight's vanity manifested in countless ways that made Brutus's existence more difficult, but nowhere was this more apparent than in their arrivals. Whether approaching a castle, entering a tournament, or merely trotting into some insignificant village that happened to have a halfway decent tavern, Sir Reginald insisted on making an entrance. The preparations always began far too early. Edwin would be roused before dawn to polish every inch of Brutus's barding until it gleamed, regardless of whether the armor had any practical need to be worn that day. The boy would then spend hours brushing Brutus's coat, picking out his hooves, and weaving ribbons into his mane, a process that left Brutus standing for so long that his legs would lock, only to be viciously spurred into motion moments later. The worst was the tail braiding. Sir Reginald had once seen a Lombard knight's horse with an elaborately knotted tail, and immediately demanded the same for Brutus, never considering that the Lombard horse had probably been a pampered show animal, rather than a war horse expected to charge into battle with decorative tassels flapping behind. When the time came for the grand entrance itself, Sir Reginald would mount with exaggerated care, settling into the saddle as if he were being crowned, rather than simply sitting on a horse. Then came the endless adjustments, the cloak arranged just so, the helmet tilted at what he imagined was a dashing angle, the sword positioned to catch the light. Brutus quickly learned that these were the moments when standing perfectly still was crucial. Any shifting of weight or flick of an ear would earn a sharp yank on the reins and hissed admonishments about spoiling the moment. The walk itself was torture. Sir Reginald insisted on what he called the noble gait, a slow, prancing step that was neither comfortable for Brutus nor particularly impressive to anyone watching. The knight would sit rigidly straight, one hand on the reins, the other resting on his thigh, in what he clearly imagined was a regal pose. In reality, it made him look like a man desperately trying not to fall off while simultaneously needing to urinate. The pace was excruciating, fast enough to require constant attention to foot placement, but slow enough that Brutus's muscles ached from the unnatural tension. Of course, the real problem with these processions was the additional weight. Beyond his armor and weapons, Sir Reginald would invariably decide at the last moment to add some new decorative element to his ensemble. A heavier cloak for colder days, the fur trim makes me look more imposing. An oversized ceremonial sword he couldn't actually wield. It's about the symbolism, Brutus, or, on one memorable occasion, an entire roasted pig strapped to the saddle as a gift for their host, which had begun attracting dogs by the 3rd mile. Each addition meant more strain on Brutus's already overtaxed back, but Sir Reginald remained blissfully unaware of the physics involved in equine endurance. The knight's vanity extended to Brutus's appearance in ways that were both pointless and painful. The armored chanfron covering Brutus's face was bad enough with its restricted vision, but Sir Reginald had commissioned an additional crest attachment that made the whole apparatus nearly unbearable. A carved wooden dragon's head had been affixed to the top, complete with gilded scales and actual bull's horns that added significant weight, while serving no purpose whatsoever except to make Sir Reginald feel more impressive. Brutus had tried repeatedly to rub the contraption off against trees and posts, succeeding only in earning himself tighter straps and more frequent inspections. The true absurdity came when they actually reached their destination. Sir Reginald would halt Brutus at what he deemed the perfect dramatic distance from whomever he was trying to impress, close enough to be seen clearly, but far enough to require an annoyingly prolonged approach. Then would come the ridiculous ritual Brutus had come to dread. The knight would raise one arm in greeting, kick Brutus sharply to initiate movement, and immediately pull back on the reins to make the horse rear up on command. The rearing was the worst part. It looked impressive in theory, a massive warhorse rising up on its hind legs, front hooves pawing at the air, while its armored rider gestured grandly. In practice, it was an unnatural, uncomfortable maneuver that put tremendous strain on Brutus's hindquarters and back. Sir Reginald, of course, had no concept of this. He only knew that when Brutus reared, people looked impressed, and therefore it must be done at every opportunity. Never mind that the motion frequently caused the knight to slide dangerously backward in the saddle, or that Brutus had nearly toppled over more than once when his hooves slipped on whetstones. After these performances, Sir Reginald would dismount with the same exaggerated care he'd used to mount, often pausing to adjust his clothing or hair before deigning to acknowledge anyone present. Brutus would be left standing, still saddled and barded, while the knight basked in whatever attention he'd managed to garner. No one ever complimented the horse, though Brutus did all the actual work. No one noticed how his breath came harder after these displays, or how his legs trembled slightly from the strain. They only saw the armor, the crest, the pageantry, all the carefully crafted illusions of knightly grandeur. The return trips were somehow worse. Having made his grand entrance, Sir Reginald would inevitably drink too much at whatever feast or celebration followed, which meant Brutus had to carry back both their weight and the knight's wobbling attempts to remain upright. More than once Brutus had been forced to walk with deliberate care to keep his inebriated rider from tumbling off, only to be rewarded with drunken slaps to the neck and slurred accusations of stubbornness when he avoided particularly rough patches of road. The final insult came when they returned to camp or castle. While grooms rushed to help Sir Reginald dismount, and inevitably to compliment him on some imagined battlefield prowess, Brutus would be left standing, still fully armored, until someone remembered to attend to it. The barding would come off in whatever order was most convenient for the handlers, not the horse. The saddle would be yanked away without care for where it pinched. The bridle would be removed last, often with a careless jerk that caught the corners of Brutus's mouth. And through it all, Sir Reginald would be holding court, recounting exaggerated versions of their exploits to anyone who would listen, tales in which he was always the hero, and Brutus was, at best, an afterthought, a prop, a living platform for his vanity. As Brutus stood in his stall each night, chewing on whatever meager hay had been provided, he often wondered what would happen if he simply refused to perform, if he stopped mid-rear, if he ignored the spurs, if he walked at his own pace rather than the ridiculous noble gait. But he never did, because warhorses didn't get to have pride. They only got to carry it for others. The next time you see a painting of some glorious knight making his grand entrance, look closer. Notice the horse's strained muscles, the too tight reins, the armor designed for show rather than function. And ask yourself, who was really carrying the weight of that knight's reputation? Chapter 6. Stable life, far from luxurious. Brutus had heard the stable hands whisper about legendary castles where horses lived better than most peasants, where stone stables stayed warm in winter, where fresh straw appeared daily, where troughs overflowed with clean water and the choicest oats. These mythical stables existed somewhere beyond the horizon, in lands where kings apparently had nothing better to do than pamper their horses. Sir Reginald's stables were not those stables. The first lie was that they were even inside the castle walls. While the knight boasted of Hollow Hill's famous stables to anyone who would listen, the truth was Brutus and his fellow horses lived in a drafty wooden outbuilding that leaned slightly to the left, as if trying to quietly escape its own existence. The roof leaked in at least 7 places that Brutus could count, each drip finding its own special rhythm to torment him during rainstorms. The walls had gaps wide enough to let in the winter wind, yet somehow too narrow to let out the summer flies. The stalls were barely wider than Brutus himself, designed by someone who clearly believed horses slept standing up like statues rather than actual living creatures who might occasionally want to turn around or lie down. When he did attempt to rest, the stone floor, which Sir Reginald called a noble foundation, pressed against his joints with all the comfort of a pile of armor. The thin layer of straw scattered across it did little to cushion the impact, though it did provide an excellent home for the stable's thriving population of fleas. Ah, the fleas, the true lords of Hollow Hill stables. They thrived in the damp straw, launching their tiny assaults with military precision. Brutus had developed an elaborate system of tail swishing and skin twitching to combat them, but it was a hopeless battle. The stable hands occasionally tossed some foul-smelling herbs into the stalls when the infestation became too obvious, but this only succeeded in making the fleas angrier without actually reducing their numbers. Then there was the matter of bedding. In theory, the straw was changed regularly. In practice, regularly meant whenever Edwin could be bothered, which was approximately never. The same sad clumps of straw remained for weeks, gradually transforming into a damp, malodorous matting that stuck to Brutus's coat and attracted every manner of biting insect. Once, after a particularly rainy autumn, the straw had actually begun sprouting mushrooms, an event that had briefly excited the stable cat until it realized they weren't the hallucinogenic kind. Water came from a trough that was cleaned on the same schedule as the straw changes. Never. Its surface usually decorated with a fine scum of algae and the occasional drowned mouse. Brutus had learned to drink quickly before the taste became unbearable, though this often meant swallowing bits of whatever had fallen into the water that day. Bits of hay, insects, once an entire chicken feather that had made him sneeze violently for hours. Food was another exercise in disappointment. The oats were often musty, the hay frequently contained more dust than nutrition, and the occasional apples or carrots that appeared were usually the sad, wrinkled rejects from the kitchen. Brutus had once watched from his stall as a visiting noble's horse was given an entire bushel of fresh apples, while he received a single worm-eaten specimen that had clearly rolled under a cabinet weeks earlier. When he dared to snort in protest, Edwin had smacked his nose and muttered something about ungrateful beasts. The stables were never quiet. Between the grooms banging about at all hours, the rats having their nightly turf wars in the rafters, and the inevitable drunken stable hand who thought 3 a.m. was the perfect time to practice his lute skills, rest was a rare commodity. The other horses added to the cacophony with their own problems, the old mare coughing like a dying blacksmith's bellows, the young gelding who kicked his stall walls in endless frustration, the pony who screamed like a damned soul every time someone walked past with a bucket. Winter transformed the stables into a special kind of hell. The gaps in the walls whistled with icy drafts that made Brutus's joints ache, while the moisture from his breath condensed on the ceiling, only to drip back down as freezing droplets. His water trough developed a skin of ice that had to be broken each morning, a task the grooms performed with all the enthusiasm of men being asked to dig their own graves. The thin layer of frost that formed on his back overnight wouldn't melt until midday, assuming the sun deigned to appear at all. Summer brought different torments. The stagnant air grew thick with flies, and the stench of too many animals packed too closely together. Heat radiated from the wooden walls until the stables felt like a bread oven, the humidity turning each breath into a labor. The flies clustered around Brutus's eyes and nose, drinking his tears and exploring his nostrils with terrifying boldness. At least winter's cold kept the smell of manure somewhat contained. In summer, the piles behind the stables fermented into a miasma that hung over everything like a poisonous cloud. Cleanliness was a concept the Hollow Hill stables acknowledged but never embraced. Brutus's coat, which should have been glossy black, usually carried a permanent gray tinge from the dust and dirt ground into it. His mane and tail became tangled mats that the grooms only addressed when Sir Reginald was expected to visit. And even then their idea of grooming was to yank a comb through the knots with all the finesse of a butcher jointing meat. The occasional bath, when it came, involved icy water and a stiff brush wielded by someone who seemed to believe dirt could only be removed by taking several layers of skin with it. Medical care was predictably primitive. The stablemaster's solution to nearly every ailment was the same: a foul-smelling poultice applied with unnecessary force. Brutus had suffered through this treatment for everything from a minor hoof bruise to a fly bite, each application accompanied by dire warnings about bad humors and miasmatic influences. The one time he'd actually needed serious attention, a deep cut from a stray arrow. They'd sewn him up with thread borrowed from the castle seamstress, while pouring ale directly into the wound because someone had heard it cleanse the injury. Through it all, Brutus had to listen to Sir Reginald boast to visitors about the excellent accommodations provided for his horses. The knight would stride down the stable aisle, pointing out features that existed only in his imagination: ample ventilation, clean, dry bedding, the finest feeds. Visitors would nod politely while their horses exchanged knowing looks with Brutus and the others. The lie was so transparent, even the rats didn't believe it. The truth was, castle stables were no paradise. They were damp, dirty, overcrowded prisons where horses waited between battles and tournaments, their comfort always secondary to their utility. The grand stone castles might gleam in the sunlight, their banners fluttering proudly, but their stables remained firmly in the shadows, both literally and figuratively. As Brutus stood in his stall one evening, picking listlessly at his musty hay while a cold drip from the ceiling found its way precisely between his ears, he came to a grim realization. Even when knights weren't actively trying to get him killed in battle or tournaments, their neglect and arrogance made everyday life its own kind of battlefield, just with more fleas and worse accommodations. The next time you imagine a medieval castle's stables as cozy havens, where noble steeds rested in comfort, remember the truth. Remember the drafts, the damp, the rats, the endless itching. Remember that for every warhorse celebrated in song, there were dozens standing in their own filth, waiting for the next time their riders needed something to carry them toward glory. Chapter 7. The Mystery of Horse Armor Fitting. There existed in the world few processes more baffling than the fitting of armor to a horse. It was a ritual that combined the precision of peasant guesswork with the patience of a hungry seagull, all conducted by men who seemed convinced horses were shaped like barrels with legs. Brutus had endured this nonsense more times than he could count, and each session left him with new questions about human intelligence and fresh sores in places he hadn't known could shake. The farce always began with Sir Reginald summoning the armorer, a perpetually harried man named Godwin who smelled of onions and resentment. Godwin would arrive with his apprentices hauling various metal contraptions, all while loudly complaining that horses were never the same shape twice, and that he should have apprenticed to a candle maker instead. Brutus would be led to the fitting platform, a wooden structure that wobbled alarmingly, where the real torment began. First came the measuring, though measuring was too generous a term for what actually occurred. Godwin would circle Brutus with a length of knotted string, muttering numbers that his apprentice would scrawl onto a wax tablet. The string would wrap around Brutus's chest one day, his belly the next, never in the same place twice. Sometimes Godwin would pause, squint at Brutus's shoulders, and make a noise like a leaky bellows before starting over. The fact that Brutus hadn't magically changed shape since yesterday never seemed to factor into these calculations. Then came the test fittings, where pre-made armor pieces would be held against Brutus's body, while Godwin and Sir Reginald debated aesthetics over functionality. The knight always insisted on details that made the armor harder to fit. Extra fluting here, decorative ridges there. While Godwin countered that perhaps they should focus on making sure the damn horse could breathe first. These discussions often escalated into arguments about heraldry versus practicality, during which Brutus would be left standing with a cold metal plate pressing into his ribs. The patral, the chest plate, was always the first piece tried, and always the worst fit. Either it squeezed Brutus's pectorals like an overzealous lover, or hung so loose it clanged against his knees when he walked. Godwin's solution was usually to pound on it with a hammer, until it sort of matched Brutus's shape, a process that left the horse's ears ringing for hours. The armorer would then declare it close enough and move on before anyone could point out that the edges now dug into Brutus's armpits. Next came the flanchets, the side plates that were supposed to protect Brutus's ribs. These never accounted for the simple fact that horses breathe, their ribs expanding and contracting with each breath. Godwin would strap them on while Brutus stood still, declare the fit perfect, then look genuinely surprised when the armor started creaking ominously the moment Brutus took his first deep breath. The usual adjustment involved punching more holes in the straps and pulling them tighter, solving the creaking by ensuring Brutus couldn't inhale fully. The crinet, the neck covering, was a particular masterpiece of discomfort. Composed of overlapping metal plates, it was supposed to allow freedom of movement while providing protection. What it actually did was pinch Brutus's mane with every turn of his head and develop razor-sharp edges that shaved patches of hair from his neck. Godwin's apprentice once suggested rounding the edges, earning a cuff to the ear and a lecture about how that wasn't how it was done in Milan. The chanfron, the head armor, was where all pretense of functionality went to die. Not only did it obscure Brutus's vision with its narrow eye slits, but its various crests and decorations threw off his balance. The latest iteration included a metal spike between the eyes that Sir Reginald insisted looked imposing, though its main effect was making Brutus look slightly cross-eyed as he tried to see past it. The straps under his jaw inevitably rubbed raw spots, which the stable hands would then smear with a foul-smelling salve that attracted every fly in the county. Perhaps the greatest insult was that, after all this effort, the armor still didn't fit properly. Brutus had learned to recognize the signs of an impending disaster. The telltale creak of a strap about to snap, the ominous shifting of a plate before it slipped, the particular pressure that signaled a buckle was digging into his spine. He developed a whole vocabulary of discomfort that went completely ignored until something actually broke or drew blood. The final fitting always followed the same pattern. Sir Reginald would stride around Brutus, nodding approvingly at how the armor gleamed in the sunlight, having been polished to distraction, while ignoring all the fit issues. Godwin would look relieved to be nearly done. Brutus would stand perfectly still, knowing any movement might restart the entire process. And then, the moment the humans stepped back to admire their handiwork, some piece would shift or pinch or simply fall off, prompting sighs all around. The true miracle was that anyone expected a horse to move, let alone charge into battle, while wearing these metallic torture devices. Between the restricted vision, the impaired breathing, and the constant chafing, it was a wonder warhorses could function at all. Brutus often suspected the only reason medieval warfare worked was that all the horses were equally miserable in their ill-fitting armor. Even after the fitting was declared complete, the torment continued. The armor had to be broken in, which meant Brutus had to wear it for increasingly long periods, while everyone ignored his increasingly obvious distress signals. A pinned ear here, a tail swish there, subtle hints that went unheeded until he resorted to the equine equivalent of screaming, at which point someone might grudgingly adjust a strap before declaring the problem solved. Through it all, Sir Reginald remained blissfully oblivious to the fundamental absurdity of the process. That a living, breathing creature couldn't be armored like a piece of furniture never seemed to occur to him. That the armor's weight and rigidity worked against the very qualities that made horses valuable in battle. Their speed and agility was never considered. All that mattered was that it looked impressive from 20 paces, and that the bards would describe it glowingly in their songs. As Brutus stood for the 7th consecutive hour of yet another fitting session, a cold metal edge slowly sawing into his shoulder, he came to a realization. Horse armor wasn't designed for horses at all. It was designed for the fragile egos of the men who rode them. Every pinching strap, every vision-obscuring plate, every unbalanced crest existed not to protect the horse, but to make the knight feel more important. The next time you admire a suit of gleaming horse armor in a museum, look closer. Notice the uneven wear on the straps, the odd angles of the plates. Imagine the living creature that had to move beneath that metal shell. And ask yourself, how much of history's grandeur was built on the silent suffering of those who couldn't say no? Chapter 8. Diet, Feast or Famine? If there was one constant in Brutus's life, it was the complete lack of consistency when it came to meals. The knight's horse care regimen seemed to follow only two extremes. Either he was being stuffed like a prize goose before a tournament, or he was eyeing his own tail as a potential snack during sieges. There was no middle ground, no sensible moderation, just the perpetual swing between gluttony and desperation, dictated entirely by Sir Reginald's current whims and the castle's ever-fluctuating resources. The feasting periods were almost as unpleasant as the famines. Before any major battle or tournament, Sir Reginald would suddenly develop a fleeting interest in equine nutrition, ordering the stable hands to fatten up the beast with all the subtlety of a farmer preparing a hog for slaughter. Brutus's trough would overflow with oats that were suspiciously fresh, clearly commandeered from some nearby merchant who'd been promised payment after the victory, alongside carrots that hadn't yet gone woody and the occasional molasses-drenched bran mash that left his muzzle sticky for hours. The stable boys would stand watch to ensure he ate every last grain, poking him with sticks if he dared pause to breathe between mouthfuls. These forced binges came with their own special miseries. No one considered that a horse accustomed to meager rations might need time to adjust to sudden abundance. Brutus' digestive system, trained by years of scraping by on moldy hay, would rebel violently against this unaccustomed luxury. The rich oats gave him gas so potent it could clear a banquet hall, while the molasses left him with a thirst no amount of algae-filled water could quench. The stable hens would complain about the resulting mess while continuing to shovel more food into his trough, caught in the absurd cycle of overfeeding him while simultaneously punishing him for the consequences. The real irony was that just as Brutus's body would begin adjusting to the feast, the event would arrive, and he'd be expected to perform at peak condition while bloated and uncomfortable. Charging into battle with a stomach full of half-digested rich grains was its own special torment. Every jostle and jump threatened to bring his breakfast back up, while the tight girth around his middle made breathing an Olympic feat. More than once he'd returned from a tournament not with glory, but with colic, left to suffer in his stall while Sir Reginald complained about the inconvenience of a delicate warhorse. Then would come the inevitable swing back to scarcity. Whether due to a lost battle, a poor harvest, or simply Sir Reginald forgetting that horses needed to eat year-round, rather than just when he needed them to look impressive, the lean times always arrived with brutal suddenness. The fresh oats vanished overnight, replaced by hay so old it crumbled to dust when touched. The water trough would go unfilled for days at a stretch, leaving Brutus to lick moisture off the stones after rainstorms. Even the stable rats grew leaner during these periods, their usual thefts from Brutus's meager rations no longer worth the risk. Zegas were the worst. When castles closed their gates and settled in for months of stubborn resistance, horses quickly became walking larders in the eyes of desperate humans. The grain stores that should have gone to Brutus would be reallocated to human soldiers, with vague promises that the horses could graze on whatever they could find within the walls. This typically meant chewing on the thatched roofs of outbuildings, gnawing at fence posts, and developing an intimate knowledge of which castle weeds were merely bitter verses, which would give you violent diarrhea. Brutus had once spent an entire siege surviving on nothing but the moss growing between courtyard stones and the occasional stolen bite of a knight's ornamental hedge. The physical toll of these cycles was brutal. Brutus's ribs would become prominent during lean times, his coat dull and patchy, only for the sudden feasts to stretch his shrunken stomach painfully. His teeth, worn down from chewing on bark and tough old hay, struggled with the alternating waves of luxury feed and near-starvation rations. Even his hooves suffered, growing brittle during famines only to split and crack when suddenly asked to carry extra weight again. What galled Brutus most was the complete lack of foresight. The same knights who planned military campaigns down to the last arrowhead couldn't be bothered to maintain consistent feed schedules for their most vital assets. Sir Reginald would act genuinely surprised each time Brutus grew thin during winter, as though the concept of seasons was some shocking new revelation, rather than an annual occurrence. The castle's quartermaster would complain about wasting grain on horses during peacetime, only to desperately scour the countryside for any available feed when war loomed. The true injustice was that no one ever connected these wild fluctuations to Brutus's performance. When he lagged during a charge, it was his laziness at fault, not the fact that he'd been living on wall moss for a fortnight. When he hesitated at a jump, it was poor training rather than the ache of overfed muscles. The humans saw only what they wanted to see, a beast of burden who should always be ready, never a living creature subject to the same basic needs as themselves. Occasionally, a visiting horse master would comment on Brutus's condition, prompting a flurry of short-lived improvements. For a week or two, his feed would be measured properly, his water kept fresh, his hay actually hay rather than something vaguely hay-adjacent found behind the stable. Then, as soon as the visitor departed, everything would revert to the usual chaos, either too much or too little, with no regard for what a horse actually required to survive, let alone thrive. Through it all, Brutus learned to cope as horses always had, by eating whatever he could whenever he could. He mastered the art of stealing apples from unattended baskets, of drinking from puddles before they could evaporate, of tolerating stomach pains as his system adjusted yet again to some new dietary extreme. It was neither living nor dying, just existing in that gray space between, always at the mercy of human whims. The next time you see a medieval tapestry showing noble knights on their mighty steeds, look closer at those horses. Notice the subtle signs, the ribs just visible beneath their coats, the hollows above their eyes, the way they stand with heads slightly lowered. Then ask yourself, how many feasts had they endured before that moment? How many famines had they survived? And how much of history's cavalry charges were powered not by noble steeds, but by desperately hungry creatures with no other choice? Chapter 9. The Short Lifespan of a Warhorse. Brutus had seen too many empty stalls in his time. The warhorse who stood snorting proudly one evening would often be gone by morning, replaced by a fresh-faced youngster with bright eyes and unbroken spirits. At first, Brutus had wondered where his stablemates disappeared to. Then he stopped wondering. The truth was written in the bloodstains on tournament grounds, the pitiful whinnies from the surgeon's tent after battles, and the growing collection of scars on his own body. The minstrels never sang about how quickly war horses burned through their lives. They spun tales of mighty steeds carrying their knights through 100 battles, but the reality was far less poetic. The average warhorse survived just 3 to 5 years of active service before something. Battle wounds, broken limbs, sheer exhaustion took them out of the rotation permanently. Brutus had lasted 7, which made him either remarkably lucky or cursed with terrible survival instincts. Battlefield mortality rates alone were staggering. In a single engagement, a cavalry charge could lose 1/3 of its horses to pike wounds, arrow fire, or simple bad footing. Brutus had once watched an entire line of destriers go down in a tangle of screaming limbs when their knights misjudged a ditch hidden by tall grass. The survivors had been put down where they lay, their agonized cries drowned out by the advancing infantry. The knights had found new mounts by nightfall. Even when they avoided mortal wounds, warhorses accumulated injuries that never fully healed. Brutus's left knee ached constantly from an old lance strike. His right shoulder bore the knotty scar of an arrow wound that had never been properly cleaned, and one ear had a permanent notch from a sword slash that had come too close to his eye. These were the marks of a veteran, but they were also ticking clocks. Every old injury was a weak point that could fail catastrophically at the worst possible moment. Broken legs were the most common end. A horse's legs were marvelous feats of engineering, capable of propelling half a ton of muscle and armor at terrifying speeds. But they were also terrifyingly fragile. A misplaced step in rough terrain, an awkward landing after a jump, or simply the accumulated stress of carrying armored riders could result in that sickening snap that meant only one thing. Brutus had learned to recognize the particular way a horse's eyes widened when it happened. First shock, then pain, then dawning understanding. The mercy stroke usually followed within minutes. Disease claimed nearly as many as battle. Warhorses lived in close quarters, shared water sources, and rarely received proper medical care. Strangles could rip through a stable like wildfire, leaving horses choking on their own swollen tissue. Colic struck unpredictably after feast or famine feeding regimens. Even minor wounds turned septic when treated with dirty hands and questionable poultices. Brutus had once shared a stall with a gelding who died of lockjaw after a minor hoof puncture. 3 weeks of agonizing muscle spasms before the end came. The older warhorses whispered about retirement, but it was largely a myth. The few who survived their service years intact were typically worked until they broke down completely, repurposed as pack animals, breeding stock, or riding horses for squires who treated them like barrels with legs. The lucky ones might end up grazing in some noble's pasture, but more often they were sold off to farmers who didn't care about their illustrious pasts, only how much weight they could pull before collapsing. Brutus had seen what became of the retired. There was Grey Tom, once the pride of Lord Ellsworth's cavalry, now hauling manure with a swayback and permanently clouded eyes. There was fiery Bella, who'd carried a knight through a dozen tournaments, reduced to giving children rides at fairs until her joints gave out entirely. And then there was Thunder, the massive destrier who'd killed 2 men with his hooves in battle, sold to a knacker when he went blind, and was no longer useful. The economics were brutally simple. Training a new warhorse took time and money, but replacing a dead one only required coin. As long as fresh horses kept coming from the breeding farms, there was little incentive to preserve the old ones. Brutus had watched Sir Reginald haggle over the price of a new sword for hours, then turn around and purchase 2 untrained colts without a second thought. The sword would last decades with proper care. The colts would be lucky to see 5. Even the way humans mourned their warhorses revealed the uncomfortable truth. Knights would compose elaborate elegies for steeds lost in battle, then buy replacements the next day. A fallen warhorse might be remembered in song, but it was rarely remembered by name, unless that name rhymed conveniently with glorious or victorious. The practicalities of war left no room for sentiment. Brutus had once seen Sir Reginald weep over a portrait of his first warhorse, then kick Brutus in the ribs for flinching at a sudden noise. The truly grim realization came when Brutus noticed the pattern in his own life. The livery stable back at Hollow Hill kept exacting records, not of glorious charges or tournament victories, but of expenses. Brutus could trace his own worth in those ledgers, watching as his value depreciated with each injury, each limp, each passing year. Sooner or later, the cost of maintaining him would exceed his usefulness, and then, perhaps that was why warhorses charged so fearlessly into battle. Not from bravery, but from the quiet understanding that death in combat was preferable to the alternatives. A quick end on the field at least came with the illusion of dignity, unlike the slow decay of being worked to death or the betrayal of the knacker's yard. The next time you admire a medieval cavalry charge in some romantic painting, take a moment to count the horses. Then imagine how many of those proud beasts would still be alive a year later. How many would make it to old age? How many would be remembered at all? The truth is written in stable records and quartermaster's logs, if you know where to look, not in songs or tapestries, but in the cold arithmetic of war. Brutus knew his own days were numbered. Every morning he rose a little stiffer. Every charge came a little slower. Every old wound ached a little more. But he would keep going, keep charging, keep surviving, not because he wanted glory, but because the alternative was already waiting in the shadows of the stable yard. Chapter 10. The forgotten retirement planned. Brutus had heard the stable hands whisper about the Green Meadow, that mythical place where old war horses went to spend their final years, grazing in sun-dappled pastures, their battle scars earning them extra apples from adoring children. These stories were always told in hushed tones when some aging campaigner was led away from the stables for the last time. The younger horses would nod along, eyes wide with hope. Brutus knew better. The truth was written in the way knights avoided meeting their mounts' eyes when the farrier pronounced them lame beyond service. It was evident in the sudden drop in feed quality when a horse could no longer charge. It lingered in the air when the knacker's cart rolled through the castle gates, its driver whistling tunelessly as he counted his coins in advance. Brutus first understood the reality of equine retirement when he watched them lead old Bayard away. The massive destrier had carried Sagara through 20 battles before his hocks gave out. There had been speeches about his glorious service, a ceremonial grooming, even a toast in the great hall. Then, when the ale had been drunk and the guests departed, Brutus saw Bayard hitched to a farmer's cart, head low as he strained to pull a load of turnips through the mud. The knight who had wept over his portrait last winter didn't even come to see him off. The lucky ones became schoolmasters, training new generations of knights how not to fall off. This was its own special hell, enduring the clumsy kicks and sawing reins of noble boys who viewed horses as animated furniture. Brutus had watched proud stallions who'd faced entire pike squares without flinch become hollow-eyed wrecks after 6 months of squires. Their coats grew dull from constant nervous sweating, their mouths tender from harsh bits, their spirits broken more thoroughly than any battle could achieve. Others were retired to breeding, though this was hardly the pleasurable existence humans imagined. Stott stallions lived in near isolation, allowed contact with mares only under strict supervision, their natural instincts reduced to scheduled performances. The mares fared little better. Constant pregnancies, foals taken too early, their bodies worn out long before their time. Brutus had known lightning, once the fastest courser in 3 counties, reduced to hobbling around his paddock on swollen joints at age 12, still expected to perform his duties until the day he collapsed trying to mount a terrified young mare. The less fortunate became cart horses. There was no crueler fate for a warhorse than to spend its golden years between shafts, its proud gait reduced to a plod, its sensitive mouth subjected to the brutal indifference of draft harness. Brutus had seen tournament champions straining to haul overloaded wagons up hills, their once muscular shoulders now just sharp angles beneath thinning coats. The knights who'd once bragged about these animals' prowess would walk past without recognition, their eyes already seeking younger, flashier models. Then there were the outright betrayed. The horses sold to questionable dealers who promised good homes, but delivered them to mines or construction sites. The ones traded to the army for a few coins, destined to die anonymously in some foreign campaign. The ones quietly led behind the stable one evening, followed by a single sharp sound and the creak of a cart being loaded before dawn. Brutus had developed a keen eye for the signs of impending retirement. The way the grooms would stop brushing a horse's scars with care and start scrubbing them with indifference. The gradual reduction in grain, then hay, then water. The disappearance of that horse's name from training rosters and its appearance on work details. The moment when its stall moved progressively farther from the stable entrance until one day, it simply wasn't there at all. Sir Reginald had once drunkenly promised Brutus a fine pasture by the river when his service ended. This from a man who couldn't remember to order hay more than 3 days in advance. Brutus had snorted his disbelief, earning a drunken slap for his ingratitude. The truth was, warhorses didn't get happy endings. They got whatever their owners could afford or bother to provide, which was usually just enough to salve human consciences without actually costing anything. The real joke was that maintaining an old warhorse properly would have cost less than training a replacement. A modest pasture, basic care, and simple dignity would have been cheap compared to the years of schooling required to make a new destrier. But humans, Brutus had learned, were terrible at long-term thinking when it came to animals. Sentiment evaporated the moment usefulness waned. Brutus often wondered which fate awaited him. The cart? The breeding shed? The knacker's knife? Or perhaps some new horror he hadn't yet imagined. He took small comfort in knowing he'd probably see it coming. Warhorses developed a sixth sense about these things, the way humans would start looking through you rather than at you, the way your gear would stop being repaired, the way your name would gradually disappear from conversations. The minstrels never sang about what happened after the glorious charges. There were no ballads about arthritic warhorses standing in the rain, waiting for death. No tapestries depicted champion steeds pulling plows until they dropped. The stories always ended at the height of glory, before the long, slow decline began. Brutus knew his own retirement wouldn't involve green meadows or gentle hands. But he took grim satisfaction in one thought. When they came for him at last, they'd find no broken-down wreck eager to please. They'd find a battle-scarred veteran with teeth, still sharp enough to leave a mark, hooves still hard enough to make a lasting impression. If warhorses couldn't choose their fates, they could at least make them memorable. Chapter 11. Breeding. A lottery of misery. Brutus knew his own pedigree better than most humans knew their family trees. The knowledge had been beaten into him from the moment his legs could support his weight. He was the product of generations of calculated suffering, his lineage carefully curated to produce the perfect instrument of war, rather than an actual living creature. The process began before conception, with breeders selecting stallions and mares based on traits that made for impressive battlefield stories, but miserable equine lives. Sides came first, the massive bones and bulging muscles that made knights feel more imposing in the saddle. Never mind that these proportions put constant strain on joints never meant to support such weight. Brutus' sire had been a monster of a horse, who could barely walk without pain by age 8, his spine sagging beneath the impossible burden of his own overbred frame. Aggression was the second prize trait. The breeders wanted horses who would charge into battle without hesitation, which translated to animals perpetually on the edge of panic or rage. Brutus's dam had been famous for breaking a groom's arm during foaling, a story told with perverse pride by the stablemaster, as if this were an accomplishment rather than a warning. This carefully cultivated temperament meant most war horses lived in a state of constant stress, their fight or flight instincts permanently dialed to fight, because anything less might mean hesitation on the battlefield. The actual breeding was its own special horror. Stallions were kept in near isolation, allowed contact with other horses only for violent, supervised couplings. Mares were restrained in breeding stocks, their protests ignored in the pursuit of that season's foal crop. Brutus had been conceived in one of these sessions, his sire whipped into frenzy before being led to a terrified mare who had no choice in the matter. It was an apt beginning for a life that would never truly be his own. Foaling itself was often traumatic, thanks to the oversized heads and broad shoulders breeders favored. Many mares died in the process, leaving orphaned foals to be hand-reared by disinterested grooms. Those who survived often rejected their freakishly large offspring, their instincts correctly identifying that something about these foals wasn't quite right. Brutus had been one of the lucky ones. His dam had lived, though she'd walked with a permanent limp afterward, and she'd at least tolerated his presence until weaning. The young horses were then put through a series of tests that would have been comical if they weren't so cruel. Potential war horses were evaluated by how violently they reacted to sudden noises, how aggressively they defended their food, how stubbornly they resisted human control. The ones who showed too much intelligence or caution were culled from the program, sold off to become cart horses, or, more likely, meat. The ones who passed were rewarded with a lifetime of battle training and early arthritis. Growth supplements, questionable mixtures of herbs, grains, and outright poisons, were force-fed to young horses to accelerate their development. Brutus's legs had ached constantly as a colt, his bones growing faster than his joints could properly support. Many of his siblings had developed limb deformities or chronic lameness by year 2, their bodies buckling under the unnatural demands placed upon them. These were quietly disposed of, their names struck from the breeding records as if they'd never existed. The true irony was that many of these prized warhorse traits made the animals worse at actual warfare. Horses bred for size often lacked the endurance for prolonged campaigns. Those selected for aggression were harder to control in the chaos of battle. The massive, jutting jaws favored by breeders because they looked powerful actually interfered with proper breathing during charges. But none of this mattered so long as the horses looked impressive, standing still for portraits. Brutus had seen the results of this breeding lottery firsthand. There was Thunderbolt, a massive stallion who could barely turn his own head due to the overdeveloped muscles in his neck. There was Ironheart, whose aggression made him unapproachable even by his own grooms. There was Poor Shadow, so large his leg shattered during his first tournament when he landed wrong from a jump. All had been considered breeding successes right up until the moment they became someone else's problem. Even the breeding successes were failures in disguise. Brutus himself was a prime example. His bloodlines were impeccable, his conformation perfect by breeder standards, his temperament just volatile enough to be useful. And yet he lived in constant pain from joints too small for his frame, fought daily against instincts that urged him to attack first and think never, and would likely die years before his smaller, calmer cousins. But in the breeder's ledgers, he was a triumph. The system perpetuated itself because no one considered the horse's experience. Knights wanted imposing chargers, breeders wanted profitable sales, and grooms wanted animals that wouldn't make them look bad. The fact that these priorities created creatures fundamentally unsuited for happy, healthy lives bothered no one. Or if it did, their objections were drowned out by the clinking of coins and the rustling of pedigree scrolls. Brutus often wondered what his ancestors might have been like in the wild. Not these hulking, nervous wrecks humans had engineered, but the original horses who had survived on wits and speed. He pictured them moving across open plains, their bodies balanced and efficient, their instincts serving them rather than tormenting them. Then he'd look at his own distorted reflection in a water trough, the too broad chest, the permanently arched neck, the eyes that always seemed slightly too wide, and understand he was as much a prisoner of his breeding as his knight's ambitions. The next time you admire a massive warhorse in some medieval painting, look closer at those proportions. Notice the strained posture, the tense muscles, the whites of the eyes showing. That's not nobility you're seeing. It's generations of calculated suffering, distilled into one impressive but miserable package. The perfect warhorse wasn't born. It was manufactured, one cruel breeding decision at a time. And when that horse finally broke down from the accumulated toll of its own engineered existence, well, there were always more where it came from. The breeding mills never stopped turning, the demand never ceased, and the cycle of suffering never truly ended. Brutus was just one link in an endless chain of pain, his pedigree both his greatest asset and his life sentence. Chapter 12. The psychological toll. Brutus had long since stopped startling at sudden noises. This was not the mark of a calm disposition, as the stable hands liked to boast, but rather the opposite. His nerves were so permanently frayed that his body no longer bothered with small warnings. He had entered a state of constant readiness, muscles always slightly tensed, ears perpetually twitching, eyes scanning for threats even in his sleep. The other veteran warhorses recognized this condition immediately. They called it the long charge, that unsustainable state where a horse's mind never truly left the battlefield, even when standing hipshot in a peaceful meadow. The signs of mental deterioration manifested in subtle ways at first. Brutus began reacting to familiar objects, as if they were mortal threats. A hanging cloak became a lurking enemy. A dropped bucket transformed into an ambush. His dreams grew violent, legs kicking out in his sleep as he relived charges long past. He developed peculiar fixations, spending hours staring at the stable door as if expecting some horror to come through it, obsessively licking the same spot on his foreleg until the hair wore away. The grooms called these behaviors quirks and laughed about them over ale. Flashbacks came without warning. The scent of burning thatch could transport Brutus instantly back to the siege of Harrowhold, where he'd stood trapped between collapsing walls with Sir Reginald's dead weight across his back. The sound of hammer on anvil became the ring of sword on shield at the Battle of Three Rivers, where he'd watched his stablemate Argent take a lance through the throat. Even the taste of certain grasses brought back memories of chewing nervously before charges, the bile rising in his throat as armor plates clanked around him. Hypervigilance made rest nearly impossible. While normal horses could sleep deeply for hours, Brutus had trained himself to doze in brief, shallow intervals, his body twitching awake at the slightest disturbance. This was how war horses died in peacetime, not from wounds but from the slow erosion of their nervous systems, their bodies finally giving out under the strain of constant alertness. The triggers were everywhere. A raised hand in his face, would it bring a treat or a blow? The sight of pikes stacked against a wall, were they resting or preparing to impale him? Even the color red, blood, or just some noble's ridiculous banner. Brutus had seen a once brave destrier reduced to a quivering wreck by something as simple as the fluttering of washing on a line. The white sheets apparently resembled surrender flags from some forgotten skirmish. Social behaviors deteriorated rapidly, among veteran war horses. Some became pathologically aggressive, attacking stablemates who came too close, their personal space having shrunk to an imaginary armored bubble. Others turned catatonic, standing motionless for days until some poor groom realized they hadn't eaten. Brutus fell into the third category, the overly attached, following Sir Reginald like a shadow whenever possible, not out of affection but from the primal understanding that the knight represented both his greatest danger and only protection. The humans noticed these changes, of course, but misinterpreted them entirely. A horse's sudden reluctance to enter tight spaces became stubbornness. Nighttime pacing was restlessness. Spooking at familiar objects was bad temperament. The concept that their mighty war horses might be suffering from shattered nerves simply didn't occur to knights who viewed animals as unfeeling machines. Treatment, when it came at all, was predictably brutal. Nervous horses were hardened through exposure to their triggers, tied near blacksmith forges until they stopped flinching at the hammer blows, forced to charge at pike walls until they no longer balked. Some broke through and became serviceable again. Others broke entirely, their minds retreating to some inaccessible place where the screams and blood couldn't reach them. These were the ones who ended up staring blankly at stable walls, unresponsive to food or prodding, until someone finally put them out of their misery. Brutus had developed his own coping mechanisms. The rhythmic grinding of his teeth against the stalled door soothed him, despite how it ruined his dental work. Pressing his forehead against walls provided a strange comfort, as if the solid pressure could hold his fracturing mind together. He'd even formed an odd bond with the stable cat, whose presence somehow reminded him that not all creatures lived in perpetual fear or violence. The true cruelty lay in how these psychological wounds rendered the horses useless to their owners long before their bodies gave out. A war horse that couldn't charge reliably, that startled at shadows, that hesitated at crucial moments. These animals might still have years of physical capability left, but their careers were over. And as Brutus well knew, a war horse without a purpose didn't tend to last long. The next time you see a medieval tapestry depicting noble knights on proud steeds, look closely at those horses' eyes. The wide whites aren't just artistic license. They're the telltale sign of creatures living in perpetual fight or flight. That's not battle readiness you're seeing, but battle damage. And unlike the knights they carried, these veterans received no songs, no pensions, no sympathetic pats on the back for their service. Just a one-way trip to the knacker when their nerves finally gave out. Brutus often wondered if humans suffered similarly after battles. Did they wake gasping from dreams of screaming horses? Did they flinch at certain smells? Did their hands shake when they lifted a cup of ale? He suspected not, or if they did, they at least had the comfort of being recognized as wounded rather than simply broken. As he stood in his stall one evening, methodically wearing grooves into the wood with his teeth, Brutus came to a grim realization. He wasn't just carrying Sir Reginald's weight into battle. He was carrying the knight's conscience too. All the fear, guilt, and horror that humans couldn't or wouldn't process themselves. Every charge, every killing blow, every death scream. The horses absorbed it all, storing the trauma in twitching muscles and nervous tics while their riders boasted in the great hall. Perhaps that was the true purpose of war horses. Not just to carry knights into battle, but to carry away the psychological costs afterwards. Living, breathing vessels for all the things warriors dared not feel themselves. And like any overburdened vessel, they could only hold so much before they shattered completely. Chapter 13. The Unspoken Injuries. Brutus carried his scars like a living map of medieval warfare, each mark telling a story no bard would ever sing. The jagged line along his ribs where a poorly cleaned axe wound had festered for weeks. The patch of rough white hair where boiling oil had splashed his flank during a siege. The slight unevenness in his gait from that arrow strike to the shoulder that never quite healed right. These were the true medals of his service, written in pain and ignored by all who saw them. Hoof problems plagued every war horse, though few knights understood the agony they caused. Brutus's front left had developed a chronic crack from years of pounding across hard terrain, while carrying armored riders. The farrier's solution was always the same: hot iron and nails, searing the sensitive inner tissues to toughen them. This brutal cauterization left Brutus limping for days afterward, his hoof oozing foul-smelling discharge that attracted flies. The knights called this routine maintenance rather than what it was: the systematic torture of the very foundation that kept their horses moving. Joint injuries accumulated silently beneath Brutus's battle scars. Years of carrying excessive weight had worn the cartilage in his knees to a frayed remnant, each step sending grinding sensations up his legs. Cold mornings left him stiff as an old gate, his muscles protesting any movement until they reluctantly warmed. The stable hands would whip him for moving too slowly, never considering that the same battles they bragged about had left his body in ruins. Battle wounds received only the most basic attention. Unless an injury immediately prevented service, it went untreated. Brutus had once gone 3 days with a broken tooth before anyone noticed his difficulty eating, and even then the solution had been to yank the remainder out with dirty pliers rather than proper treatment. Another time he developed an abscess beneath his saddle area that burst during a charge, coating his legs in pus and blood. Sir Reginald had complained about the mess rather than the suffering. Skin conditions flourished in the damp, filthy stables. Rain rot left patchy bald spots along Brutus's back where the skin cracked and bled. Manga mitis burrowed into his fetlocks, causing incessant itching that no amount of rubbing against posts could satisfy. The grooms occasionally slathered him with rancid tallow or vinegar solutions that burned worse than the conditions they treated, their remedies often more painful than the afflictions. Digestive issues became a constant companion, thanks to the erratic feeding schedule. Colic struck without warning, leaving Brutus sweating and trembling in his stall as his gut twisted upon itself. The stablemaster's cure was to force down a mixture of ale and ground charcoal, then walk Brutus in circles until either the pain subsided or the horse collapsed. Gas from sudden rich feedings built up until Brutus's sides resembled overfilled bellows, each movement threatening to release embarrassing but agonizing pressure. I suffered terribly in battle conditions. Flying debris, enemy strikes, and infections from filthy armor left many warhorses partially or fully blind. Brutus's right eye had developed a milky film after a lance splinter embedded itself there during a tournament. The tournament surgeon had removed the visible wood, but left the infection to fester, resulting in permanent cloudiness that made judging distances difficult. Knights called this the mark of a veteran rather than the disability it was. Respiratory damage came from multiple sources. The constant inhalation of battlefield dust and smoke left many warhorses with a chronic cough. Ill-fitting armor pressed on windpipes, restricting breathing during crucial moments. Brutus had developed a peculiar whistling sound when exerting himself, as if his lungs were protesting the very air they processed. On cold nights his breathing became labored and wet, though no one but the stable cat seemed to notice. Perhaps the cruelest injuries were the psychological ones made manifest in flesh. Brutus had chewed his own flank raw during one particularly bad siege. The pain of self-mutilation somehow preferable to the constant tension. Other warhorses developed similar coping mechanisms, rubbing their faces raw against walls, biting their own legs, kicking stall doors until their hooves splintered. These were dismissed as bad habits rather than recognized as what they were: the physical expression of mental anguish. Dental issues caused slow starvation in many older warhorses. Without proper floating, sharp points developed on Brutus's molars that lacerated his cheeks with every chew. Missing or broken teeth made processing tough forage nearly impossible. Yet tooth care was considered an extravagance except for the most valuable breeding stallions, leaving workhorses like Brutus to suffer in silence as they tried to nourish their battered bodies. The cumulative effect of these untreated injuries transformed proud war horses into limping wrecks far sooner than necessary. Brutus had watched stronger horses than himself reduced to shadows of their former glory by the slow accretion of pain. A limp here, a head tilt there, until one day they simply couldn't rise when cold. The knights would shake their heads and mutter about age, never acknowledging how many of these old age deaths were actually the result of years of accumulated damage, finally reaching critical mass. What galled Brutus most was how many of these injuries could have been prevented with basic care. Regular hoof maintenance instead of emergency interventions. Proper wound cleaning instead of letting festering injuries run their course. Consistent feeding schedules to avoid digestive distress. But time and resources were always prioritized for the next battle rather than healing from the last one. The next time you see a medieval warhorse depicted in art, look past the shiny armor and proud bearing. Notice instead the slight head tilt of a horse compensating for blind spots. The uneven stance of legs carrying old injuries. The patchy coat marking years of skin conditions. These are the true stories of medieval warfare, not glorious charges and noble sacrifices, but the slow, painful accumulation of damage that no one bothered to treat until it was too late. Brutus knew his own body was a timepiece counting down to inevitable collapse. Each injury, large or small, had taken something from him that would never return. The knights might mend their armor and polish their swords after each battle, but no one came to repair a warhorse's broken parts. They were left to heal crookedly or not at all, their pain just another unspoken cost of doing business in the age of chivalry. As he stood in his stall one evening, favoring his bad leg while flies clustered around his weeping hoof crack, Brutus came to understand the fundamental truth of his existence. War horses weren't wounded in service. They were worn out, slowly and indifferently, like poorly maintained tools. And like any tool, they would be discarded the moment they became more trouble to maintain than replace. The injuries weren't unfortunate accidents. They were the inevitable result of a system that valued horses only for what they could do, never for what they were. The truly unspoken injury was this, the knowledge that every day of survival simply meant more pain to come, with no hope of relief except the final merciful stroke that would end it all. And that was one wound no amount of armor could protect against. Chapter 14. The Myth of the Noble Steed. Every child knew the stories. The valiant warhorse charging fearlessly into battle beside its beloved knight, the loyal companion who would defend its master to the death, the noble steed whose courage and devotion knew no bounds. Brutus had heard these tales recited by minstrels in castle halls, watched them depicted in tapestries lining noble chambers, even endured Sir Reginald drunkenly slurring his way through exaggerated accounts of their supposed bond. The reality was so far removed from these fantasies that it would have been laughable if the consequences weren't so brutal. The myth of mutual loyalty between knight and steed dissolved under the slightest scrutiny. Brutus had never been given a choice about his profession, never sworn an oath of fealty, never received payment for his service. His devotion consisted of responding correctly to pain stimuli. The sharp bite of spurs meant go. The sawing pressure of reins meant stop. The relentless kick to the ribs meant charge straight into hell itself. What humans called loyalty was simply a terrified creature's attempt to minimize its suffering. The famous warhorse bravery so celebrated in song was equally fictitious. Horses didn't charge into battle out of courage, but because every survival instinct had been systematically beaten out of them. Between the armor restricting their vision, the spurs at their sides, and the press of other panicked horses behind them, most war horses couldn't have changed course if they wanted to. Their apparent fearlessness was actually paralysis, the same frozen terror that makes a rabbit stare down an approaching wolf. The stories always omitted how quickly knights replaced their fallen mounts. Brutus had seen Sir Reginald weep over a goblet of wine while recounting the death of his previous charger at the Battle of Blackwater, only to casually inspect 3 potential replacements the next morning. The dead horse's name was remembered just long enough to serve as a dramatic device in tavern tales, then forgotten as completely as last season's fashion. Even the famous tales of horses rescuing wounded knights crumbled upon examination. Brutus had once dragged Sir Reginald unconscious from a battlefield, but not out of some noble desire to save him. The knight's gloved hand had tangled in the reins, his dead weight pulling painfully at Brutus's sensitive mouth. Every stumbling step had been motivated by the instinct to escape that discomfort, not some grand heroic impulse. Of course, the minstrels had transformed this accident into a stirring ballad about undying loyalty, much to Sir Reginald's drunken delight. The so-called bond between knight and horse was entirely one-sided. Brutus could recognize Sir Reginald's footsteps, his scent, the particular way he coughed after drinking cheap wine. The knight couldn't have picked Brutus out from a line of similar black destriers unless someone pointed out the scars he himself had caused. Their entire relationship consisted of Brutus memorizing every nuance of his oppressor while remaining completely interchangeable in the knight's eyes. The myth-making extended to breeding as well. Pedigrees always emphasized famous ancestors who had died gloriously in battle, rather than acknowledging most warhorses met far less romantic ends, sold off when injured, worked to death as pack animals, or simply disappearing into the anonymous mass of cavalry horses needed for each new campaign. The bloodlines that produced such noble steeds were the same ones filling glue pots across the kingdom. Even in death, the romanticization continued. Knights would erect elaborate monuments to favored chargers while ignoring the living horses suffering in their stables. Sir Reginald had once commissioned a stained glass window depicting his second warhorse, the one before Brutus, carrying him to victory, even as the actual animal mouldered in an unmarked pit behind the castle walls. The nobility loved symbols far more than the messy reality they represented. The truth was warhorses weren't noble companions, but living weapons, as disposable as arrows and far more easily replaced. Their training deliberately broke their spirits, their treatment ignored their needs, and their entire existence served only to elevate the humans who rode them. The songs and stories transformed this exploitation into something beautiful, because the alternative, acknowledging the systematic abuse of intelligent creatures, would have forced knights to confront their own cruelty. Brutus had learned this lesson watching new colts arrive at the castle, their eyes bright with that peculiar equine curiosity. Within months, that light would fade, replaced by the dull resignation of creatures who understood their place in the world. The transformation from living being to battlefield instrument was gradual but inevitable, each stage accompanied by another layer of romantic lies about noble steeds and loyal companions. The next time you hear some stirring tale of a knight and his faithful charger, ask yourself, where are the ballads about horses sold to the knacker when they went lame? Where are the tapestries depicting colts beaten into submission? Where are the monuments to the thousands of anonymous warhorses who died unremembered in forgotten battles? The myth of the noble steed exists to obscure the simple truth. These animals were victims, not volunteers, in humanity's endless wars. As Brutus stood in his stall one evening, listening to Sir Reginald regale guests with fabricated stories of their supposed bond, he understood the final cruel joke. The more a knight romanticized his horse, the less he actually cared about the living creature. True regard wouldn't have produced flowery speeches and stained glass tributes, but clean water, proper feed, and merciful retirement. The noble steed was always most beloved as an idea, least valued as a beating heart. The myth wasn't just false. It was the gilding on a very particular kind of prison, one where the prisoner was celebrated for his chains and called noble for his suffering. And Brutus, like all war horses before him, had no voice to protest the story. Only the slow accumulation of scars and the hollow look in his eyes for anyone who cared to see the truth. Chapter 15. Alternative Careers. The Lucky Few. Brutus had known a handful of horses who escaped knightly service. These rare survivors were spoken of in hushed tones among the stable hands, their fate serving as both cautionary tales and perverse inspiration. None of their stories ended with green pastures and gentle retirements, just varying degrees of slightly less miserable existences. Take Lightning, the fiery chestnut stallion who'd once thrown Sir Gareth during a tournament. Declared too temperamental for battle, he'd been sold to a wealthy merchant's wife as a riding horse. This sounded like fortune until you saw him years later, his spirit broken by hours of plodding in circles while the woman shrieked about his gait. His once proud neck now bent permanently from the constant pressure of too tight side reins. His hooves cracked from walking paved city streets. Still, he was among the lucky ones. At least he wasn't being shot at anymore. Then there was Old Thunder, the massive destrier who'd gone blind in one eye during the siege of Harrenhal. Rather than being put down, he'd been repurposed as a mill horse. Brutus once saw him at a village fair, walking endless circles to turn a grinding stone, his blind eye weeping flies while his good one stared blankly ahead. The miller had bragged about getting a knight's horse for peasants' wages, neglecting to mention how often the confused animal still tried to rear at imaginary trumpet blasts, nearly upsetting the grinding mechanism each time. The cart horses were perhaps the saddest cases. Brutus recognized many as former war horses by their scars and the way they still carried their heads high despite their circumstances. There was Valor, who'd once carried a banner at the Battle of Three Rivers, now holding turnips with a sway back and permanently damaged hocks. There was Storm, the gray who'd jumped tournament barriers with ease, reduced to dragging a brewer's dray with a permanent limp from an untreated tendon injury. Their aristocratic breeding meant nothing now except slightly more refined bone structure beneath their patchy coats. The luckiest of all might have been Buttercup, a once ferocious charger sold to a nunnery after developing an irrational fear of armor clanging. The sisters used her to pull their vegetable cart to market once a week, spending the rest of her days grazing in their orchard. Of course, the same nuns thought nothing of working her in harness while pregnant or leaving her unblanketed in winter storms. Their charity extended only so far as their limited understanding of animal care. Even the prize-breeding stallions lived lives of quiet desperation. Brutus once saw mighty Blackheart, sire of 3 generations of war horses, confined to a paddock barely large enough for him to turn around in. The once proud stallion paced neurotically along the fence line, his muscles atrophying from lack of exercise, his only purpose to mount terrified mares when ordered. The stable boys called it living like a king while mucking out his cramped enclosure. Some war horses found even stranger second acts. Brutus heard tales of one charger who'd been sold to a traveling surgeon and trained to stand motionless during amputations. Another became a carnival attraction, the night steed who counts to 10 by stomping his hoof on command. A particularly clever gelding had been repurposed as a mining horse, spending his remaining years in near darkness hauling ore carts underground. Each represented a marginal improvement over battlefield death, if one ignored the fresh indignities. True irony was that these retired war horses often worked harder and lived longer than their battlefield counterparts. A plow horse might labor into its 20s, while most war horses died before reaching 10. The peasant's nag pulling a manure cart had better odds of seeing old age than the finest destrier in a duke's stable. There was some grim justice in this. The less valued the horse, the more care taken to preserve its usefulness. Brutus sometimes fantasized about his own possible retirement scenarios. Perhaps he'd end up dragging a fisherman's boat up the beach each day, salt water stinging his leg wounds. Maybe he'd be sold to some minor noble stable where spoiled children would kick his ribs while learning to ride. There was always the chance he'd become one of those sad creatures hitched outside taverns for hours, standing in their own waste until their owners stumbled out. The one fate he never imagined was peaceful retirement. Even the rare war horses who ended up in pastures were usually the ones who could still serve as living advertisements for their knight's wealth. The moment they became inconvenient, needing special feed or medication, or simply taking up space. Their reprieves ended abruptly. Brutus had once seen an old campaigner grazing contentedly in a lord's park, only to return the next season and find a younger model in his place. No one could tell him what had become of the previous occupant. The next time you see some tired old horse pulling a farmer's cart, or plodding in a mill circle, look closer. Those scars beneath the harness marks might tell a different story. That slight flinch at sudden movements could betray a battlefield past. That unusually proud carriage of the head might be all that remains of a creature once deemed worthy of armor and songs. As Brutus watched yet another of his stablemates led away to an uncertain future, this time a mare named Victory being sold to a tinker, he understood the cruel joke. Escape from knightly service didn't mean freedom, just a different kind of servitude. Warhorses weren't built for peace, and the world had little use for creatures whose only skills involved running headlong at sharp objects. The lucky few who survived their battlefield years didn't find rest. They found new ways to be useful until there was nothing left to use. And perhaps that was the most any of them could hope for. Not a happy ending, just a slightly slower conclusion to the same sad story. Chapter 16. The Economics of a Warhorse. Brutus first understood his true worth when he overheard Sir Reginald haggling with a horse trader. The knight wasn't debating the ethics of buying another living creature, nor the horse's comfort or temperament, only the price per hand of height and the expected years of service. The transaction might as well have been for a new suit of armor or a cartload of turnips for all the sentiment involved. Warhorses occupied a strange place in medieval economics, simultaneously valuable assets and utterly disposable tools. A trained destrier could cost as much as a peasant's yearly wages, yet knights gambled them away in dice games or abandoned them after minor injuries without a second thought. Their worth was always conditional, fluctuating with battlefield needs and noble whims rather than any inherent value as living creatures. The accounting books told the real story. Brutus had seen the stablemaster's ledgers where horses were listed alongside other military equipment, between siege engines and spear shafts. His own entry read simply, Black Destrier 16 hands, purchased 1427, 200 silver marks with various sums deducted over the years for armor adjustment, hoof repair, and the ominous depreciation. The numbers never mentioned how many battles he'd survived, how many wounds he'd carried, or how many times he'd saved Sir Reginald's life. Maintenance costs were begrudged at every turn. The same knights who spent fortunes on jeweled sword hilts would argue with farriers over trimming a few coins from a hoof repair. Armor was meticulously oiled and stored, while living flesh beneath it went untreated. A single tournament could consume enough wine and feasting to stable 10 horses for a year, yet grooms had to beg for fresh hay when supplies ran low. The replacement calculus was brutally simple. When repair costs, whether for armor or the horse itself, exceeded about half the price of a new animal, the decision was made. Brutus had watched this equation play out with stablemates over the years. A bowed tendon here, cracked hoof there, and suddenly that horse would disappear from the ledgers, replaced by a younger model with no recorded history of suffering. Breeding operations followed the same cold logic. Stute fees were carefully calculated based on battle records and tournament wins rather than the health or temperament of the horses involved. Broodmares were kept pregnant until their bodies gave out, then sold off for whatever their worn-out frames could fetch. Foals who didn't meet exacting size standards by year 2 were disposed of without sentiment, the medieval equivalent of factory rejects. Even in death, warhorses had economic value. Their hides made armor lining, their hooves became glue, their bones turned into buttons and knife handles. Brutus had once seen his own predecessor's tail hair woven into a crossbow string, a fact Sir Reginald shared with perverse pride while waxing the weapon. Nothing went to waste except the horse's dignity. The true irony was that this economic view made poor practical sense. Proper long-term care would have extended most war horses' useful lives considerably. But medieval accounting couldn't quantify patience or foresight, only immediate costs and immediate returns. It was cheaper to run a horse into the ground and buy another than to maintain one properly for decades. This disposable mentality extended to training as well. The months required to properly school a warhorse represented a significant investment, yet most training relied on brutal shortcuts that damaged the animals physically and mentally. Better methods existed. Brutus had heard whispers of Moorish horsemen who trained mounts with patience and reward. But these required time few European knights were willing to spend. Why nurture when you could dominate? Why build trust when fear worked faster? The battlefield itself reflected this warped economics. Knights would spare enemy horses when possible, not out of compassion, but because healthy chargers represented plunder to be captured and resold. The same rider who'd skewer a peasant without thought would carefully avoid killing a valuable destrier, only to overwork that same animal to death within a year. Brutus's own value had followed this predictable arc. His purchase price had been a point of pride for Sir Reginald, proof of the knight's status. His maintenance had been an ongoing annoyance, a drain on household accounts. His gradual depreciation was now a matter of record, numbers ticking downward towards some inevitable conclusion. At no point had anyone factored in his loyalty, his courage, or his suffering. Those qualities didn't appear in ledgers. The next time you see a medieval manuscript depicting some noble knight on his charger, look past the glittering armor and fluttering banners. Consider instead the economics behind that image, the careful calculations of cost and utility, the balance sheets that determined a living creature's worth. The warhorse wasn't a companion or a partner, but a depreciating asset, valuable until the moment it wasn't. As Brutus felt yet another year's depreciation recorded in the stablemaster's books, he understood the final irony. All the songs and poems about noble steeds couldn't mask the simple financial truth. He was worth exactly what someone would pay for his broken body once the fighting was done. Not a copper more. And in that merciless equation, he could read his own fate as clearly as any battle standard on the horizon. The true cost of chivalry was never carried by the knights in their shining armor. It was borne on the backs of creatures who could do sums in their bones, if not on parchment, who understood their worth was always one bad step away from becoming glue. And that was an economics lesson no minstrel would ever set to music. Chapter 17. The Cavalry Charge, a Suicide Mission. The trumpet sounded, and Brutus knew what came next. That terrible moment when fear and training collided in his muscles, leaving no choice but to obey. The charge began, as it always did, with the clanking of armor and the sickening slide of visors closing, cutting off the knight's last humane expressions. Then the spurs bit deep, and hundreds of tons of flesh and steel lurched forward into catastrophe. What the songs called a glorious thunder was actually a symphony of suffering. The initial impact of armored horses hitting enemy lines was less like a wave breaking and more like fruit being pressed in a cider mill. The wet crunch of bodies giving way beneath hooves, the screams of both horses and men blending into one horrific chorus. Brutus had learned early that in a charge the horses always died first. Their greater mass made them perfect pike catchers, their unarmored legs easy targets for swinging blades. A knight might survive being unhorsed, his mount rarely did. The physics alone were brutal. Accelerating to full gallop in armor required near supernatural effort from equine hearts and lungs. Then came the sudden deceleration at impact, when all that momentum vanished in an instant, sending shock waves through legs never designed for such abuse. Brutus had felt bones crack beneath him on more than one charge, though whether they belonged to enemies or his own limbs was often impossible to tell in the moment. Vision became meaningless in the press. The chanfron's narrow eye slits showed only fragmented glimpses, a flash of steel here, a spray of blood there. Ears registered nothing but a cacophony of metal on metal, shrieks, and the awful soggy thuds of heavy bodies hitting the ground. Smell told the true story. The iron tang of fresh blood, the acrid stink of voided bowels, the burning reek of overworked horseflesh. Horse psychology made the charge even more grotesque. No sane creature would willingly run towards sharp objects, so years of training and abuse were required to override basic survival instincts. The result was animals trapped in pure cognitive dissonance, bodies surging forward while every nerve screamed retreat. Brutus often wondered if this was why so many warhorses went mad after battles, their minds finally breaking under the strain of having done the impossible too many times. The aftermath was its own special hell. Wounded horses didn't die cleanly like in minstrels' tales. They thrashed, they screamed, they dragged shattered limbs behind them until someone took pity or needed the space. Brutus had seen a mare with her guts spilled trying to stand on broken legs for hours, her blood leaving dark trails in the dirt as she crawled towards some imagined safety. The knights walked past without stopping. There were always more horses where she came from. For the survivors, the damage was cumulative. Each charge left its mark in strained tendons, microfractures, and the slow erosion of nerve. Brutus could feel it in his body, the way his wind came shorter after each gallop, how his legs took longer to stop trembling afterward. The veterans all bore that hollow look behind their eyes, the one that said they'd seen the shape of their own deaths reflected in every pike square. The true irony was how ineffective charges often were against prepared foes. A wall of disciplined infantry with polearms could stop cavalry dead in its tracks, leaving a writhing mound of horseflesh for the next wave to stumble over. Yet knights kept ordering them, kept spending lives like copper coins, because the alternative, fighting on foot like common soldiers, was unthinkable to their fragile egos. Brutus had developed his own survival strategies over the years. He'd learned to angle his body slightly at impact, letting the knight's lance take the brunt rather than his chest. He'd discovered how to twist falling so his legs wouldn't trap beneath him. Most importantly, he'd mastered the art of appearing just spirited enough to satisfy Sir Reginald without actually committing to suicidal bravery. These small acts of rebellion were all that stood between him and the fate of so many others. The next time you see some tapestry depicting a heroic cavalry charge, look past the fluttering banners and gleaming armor. Notice instead the horses' eyes, wide with terror, not fury. See the way their bodies are positioned not in proud attack, but in desperate attempts to stop. That's not nobility you're witnessing. It's mass suicide disguised as warfare. As Brutus stood trembling after yet another charge, his coat lathered in sweat and blood not his own, he understood the final bitter truth. The cavalry charge wasn't a tactic. It was a spectacle, a ritual sacrifice where horses played the role both priest and victim, and the altar was always hungry for more. Chapter 18. The Afterlife of a Knight's Horse. Brutus had seen enough warhorses to know one thing for certain. Death was not the end of their servitude. The legends spoke of Valhalla for warriors, of heavenly rewards for the faithful, of shadowy realms where souls wandered in peace. But no one ever mentioned where the horses went. The stable hands had their theories, of course. Old Gervais claimed warhorses were reborn as destriers again and again, doomed to charge into battle for eternity. Young Tom swore they haunted the fields where they fell, their ghostly hooves pounding the earth on moonlit nights. The butcher's boy, who had a disturbingly practical view of the world, said they simply ceased to exist, turned into glue, leather, and meat pies, their souls as disposable as their bodies. Brutus had his own suspicions. He imagined a great spectral stable where the dead warhorses stood, still saddled, still armored, waiting for riders who would never come. Their chains were invisible now, but they remained tethered to the earth by the weight of human memory. Or rather, the lack of it. A knight might be memorialized in stone, his deeds etched into history, but his horse? A footnote. A prop knight. A nameless beast forgotten before its body had even cooled. Occasionally, a fallen warhorse did earn a place in legend, but always in service to its rider's glory. Brutus had heard the bards sing of the black charger of Westmarch, who had carried his knight through a hail of arrows before collapsing at the castle gates. A noble end, they said. A loyal beast. Yet when the song was done, no one remembered the horse's name, only that he had died for his master. Even in death, he was a supporting character of someone else's story. The afterlife, Brutus decided, would probably be just like the mortal world, except with more flies. There would be fields, yes, but they would be the kind of fields knights trained in, not the soft, endless meadows of a horse's dreams. There would be no pain, but there would still be spurs. No hunger, but still the distant nagging sense that dinner might be withheld if one failed to perform. There might even be other horses, but they would all be just as weary, just as resigned, standing in spectral formation, waiting for a charge that never came. And the riders? Oh, they would be there too. Brutus could picture them now, shimmering knights in tarnished armor, still boasting of their victories, still oblivious to the suffering of the creatures beneath them. They would mount up again, these dead lords of war, and kick their phantom steeds forward, not because there was any battle left to fight, but because old habits died harder than horses. Perhaps, Brutus mused, the only true escape was to be forgotten entirely. No ballads, no paintings, no grand tales of sacrifice. Just silence. Just rest. A horse could do worse than to fade into nothingness, untethered from the weight of human history. But then again, he thought, as Sir Reginald tightened his girth for another charge, maybe the afterlife didn't matter at all. Maybe the real curse was this is life, the endless cycle of battle and burden, of being remembered only as long as you were useful. And if that was the case, then Brutus had only one wish for whatever came next. They may be forgotten faster than the rest. Wouldn't that end it for?